What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Middle Album Reactions, where we got an album review for you today. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a while now. I've been listening to it, taking my time with it. Really interesting album here. We've got Imperial Triumphant is the name of the band, and the album is called Vile Luxury. So if you've been hearing a little bit about this album, seeing some of the buzz, what this is basically a heavy, dark, avant-garde album. So this is the type of album that I've actually been looking for as a fan of avant-garde for a long time. I've thought, man, what if avant-garde went in sort of like a death metal, blackened death metal direction? What would it sound like, and what would that be like? I didn't know that it was going to sound like this, though. I didn't have any idea. So seeing this come along was kind of like a revelation to me, because I've been silently wishing for and hoping for this kind of album that blended these different influences. There are no conventional melodies or song structures on this thing, and the closest band that I can think of that mirrors this sound is the band Desolate Shrine, and they had an album last year called Deliverance from the Godless Void, and that ended up being one of my favorites of the year. Fantastic album. But basically, it's this idea that you can make music that's dark, heavy, strange, and oddly, that is amelodic. Very amelodic, not a lot of memorable hooks or melodies or anything like that on this album. And instead of being focused on writing melodies and harmonies, the guitar is actually, it's more focused on hitting these really off-kilter, sort of awkward, sour sounding notes instead of crafting anything memorable per se. So it's very different from what a lot of metal listeners are used to, I would say. Even in black and death metal, you're still relying on a lot of conventional guitar sounds. This is the complete opposite. So be prepared that if you listen to this album, you're not going to be hearing a lot of power chords and a lot of conventional licks and scales, and that's not what this is about. This is a total off-the-wall, off-the-beaten-path type of album. The best part about this album is undoubtedly the drummer. He is an octopus. Like, he goes crazy on most of these tracks. The drums are so busy and so loud and so noisy, and the drums actually really occupy the majority of the space in the mix on several of these songs. So you're going to get used to hearing the drums being the loudest thing, and you'll kind of have to search and try to find the guitars, actually, most of the time, which is very strange. Usually it's the opposite. When you look at extreme metal, usually the guitars are still front and center. One particular track that stands out in this regard, where you have also a lot of additional sort of percussive noises and sounds along with the drums, and it's creating this cacophony of different sounds, and like I said, just percussive instrumentation, is the song Lower World. You guys check that out to see to get a little bit of a taste of what I'm talking about here. But it's like that through the entire album, so be prepared for that, for the percussive, the drumming. Be prepared for that to be the main focus throughout the course of this album. There's also, I have to say, a very strong, old school, like 1930s, 40s era jazz element to this album. So for example, on songs like Swarming Opulence and Cosmopolis, you have just this strong, heavy, jazz-inspired influence that dominates certain sections. It'll call to mind almost like some crazy black and white film noir movie from the old, like from the 1940s or something. You get everything on this album in that regard. You get everything from jazz piano, you get sort of that walking bass line that we're all familiar with in jazz music, jazz drumming, jazz flute, saxophone. You get the entire package. So that is a consistent influence on this album. I think from what I've understood, the different reviews I've seen and what I've read about this album, this band is from New York City, and they're really trying to evoke sort of this dark, kind of classic dirty, grimy sort of aesthetic that's representative of what it's like to live in inner city New York City, and especially at night. So you have the sort of imagine like the city at night and being in some smoky, dirty jazz lounge somewhere and listening to this. Yeah, mostly I would say that as far as jazz goes, it's progressive metal bands that are experimenting with jazz and jazz instruments. You find it in some death metal bands, but a lot of prog bands do it. But a lot of them are experimenting with jazz guitar and with different guitar scales and guitar leads that evoke sort of the jazz guitar playing. And I did review on this channel or react to one album by a band called Mammoth that was called Deviations, that had a strong jazz influence as well. But this is a little bit different. This isn't it's not like they're just pulling a certain type of guitar playing or pulling a certain type of drumming in certain sections or kind of pulling that and putting it in the album. No, these are full-fledged, fleshed out jazz sections that are going to be difficult for a lot of metal listeners, I think, to get used to. So the jazz influence on this album definitely runs a lot deeper than you find on a lot of contemporary metal albums. So that's kind of cool. My favorite tracks are Swarming Opulence, Gotham Lux, Chernobyl Blues, Cosmopolis, and The Filth. But I'm only going to be talking about Gotham Lux and Cosmopolis. So the first thing to notice about Gotham Lux is there's so much dissonance. The guitars aren't really playing any type of melody at all. They're just hitting these notes like very awkwardly, like what I was talking about before. This is definitely avant-garde, strange. I don't think I would call it black metal or death metal. It doesn't sound like either one of these to me. It doesn't sound like Gore Guts. It doesn't sound, in certain cases, in certain ways, it doesn't sound really like a Desolate Shrine, for example. I used that band earlier. The guitars themselves, I can tell they're playing something, but the mix is so noisy it's hard to focus in on what they're doing. And like I said, what they're playing is so amelodic that it might as well be a percussive instrument. The easiest way to get through this, I think, is just to call this avant-garde, because that's really what it is. The growler, he's not anything crazy, nothing to write home about per se, but he's got this very spooky, kind of haunting quality about him. It's hard to put my finger on. He's got, his voice is almost broken. It's not very smooth at all. So I don't know if he's been practicing those vocals or if that's just something that comes naturally, but whatever it is, I think it fits the vibe of the music pretty well. This reminds me again of another band called Death Spell Omega. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, but they're pretty much like an avant-garde death metal band. And yeah, this sort of reminds me of them a little bit. I'm not sure what instrument it is, but at around 3:45, there's this brass instrument that comes in that's sort of hanging in the background. I think it's a jazz flute, but I could be wrong. There's some ambient droney stuff about the 5-minute and 30-second mark. There's not as much of a jazz influence on this track, though, I would say, as other tracks like Swarming Opulence and Cosmopolis. This one is a little bit more straightforward. There's some nice piano, though, around the 7-minute and 20-second mark. All of the music goes quiet with the exception of the piano, playing this sort of dour piece. Kind of a nice way to end the track out, and then something, like I said before, something that you could imagine in like a 1940s, 30s or 40s jazz lounge somewhere in New York City. But yeah, it's cool. At the end of the track, this piano line, it kind of fractures and shatters, and then all of the pieces kind of collectively fade into the distance. It's a really cool effect. I don't know how they were able to achieve it, but I love the way this song ended. This is a really good song, but like I said, it's going to be a hard listen for a lot of people, so just be prepared. This is going to be very unconventional stuff. It's not going to be stuff that you'll sit down and listen to and go, man, that was a badass riff. You know, I could really get into this. That's not what this is at all, okay? You need to just, what I would say, if you're curious about this, before I move on to the next song, Cosmopolis, is just, if you're curious about this, just sit down, put in your iPod or whatever, and just let the music happen. Don't focus on it too hard, and don't look and wait for things that you're familiar with, sounds that you're familiar with, guitar riffs that sound sort of familiar, or chords that you're familiar with, or scales, or any of that stuff. You just accept it, allow it to happen, and then see what you feel like afterwards. That's what I would suggest, because this is going to be pretty off the wall for most people. Like I said, the last song I want to talk about is called Cosmopolis. It sounds pretty jazzy at the start. We've got some very watery chords being laid down, and then what sounds like a saxophone, walking bass. Again, this is what I talked about before. You've got that hardcore, old school New York jazz lounge type of sound, and that's what's happening here. That's like the first 2 minutes of the track are just that, so pretty unconventional. But then you've got around the 2 minutes and 5 second mark. That's when the heavy music actually starts. The vocals and the drums again really suck up most of the oxygen in the mix. So if you're a guitar fanatic or a guitar aficionado, this isn't going to be your music, because the guitars, they almost get swallowed up by the rhythm section, in my opinion. And then you have the vocals sort of leaping forth out of the void. It's a very cool aesthetic, but it's definitely something that's going to take some getting used to. At this point in the review, I do have to remark that it does sound a little bit samey. When you talk about the heavier sections on this album, when you get from song to song to song, because it's so amelodic and there's not a lot of memorable riffs or memorable scales or soloing or melodies happening, the actual, what you would call the groove or the heavier sections, a lot of them tend to sound the same throughout the course of the album. And that's one thing that kind of leaves me cold on this album, I guess. I'm happy that they're experimenting. I'm happy that it's avant-garde. But at the same time, I'd like to see a little bit more risks taken with writing melodies that are also weird and also strange, but that also give some sort of identity to each one of these tracks. Doing the same thing every single time, having the heavy sections sound the same way every time on every track, there may be subtle differences that other reviewers can point out, but I'm saying they're essentially the same, okay? It's really hard for me to latch on to any of these individual songs and say, oh man, I really enjoyed that one. I remember that one. That one was really cool. It's like they all sort of blend and bleed together. If it weren't for the way the songs were structured and the difference, like for example, the guest female vocals on Chernobyl Blues, or the jazz-inspired intro to Cosmopolis, or the just all-encompassing, chaotic, noisy rhythms of Lower Worlds, or, I wouldn't be able to pick any of these songs out from one another, because the guitars ain't getting it done in that department. I just wish maybe they would take a little bit more time and develop some guitar lines that actually stick out, that make the listener go, wow, that was really neat, I want to hear that again. Yeah, this song, needless to say, it does wind down after about the 7-minute mark. Not a lot to say about this song that hadn't already been said in this review. In other words, guys, I think this is a good album. It's not going to be one of my top albums of the year. I think it is interesting, and it is worth noting, and it was worth doing a review on. I'm glad I listened to it as much as I did. But yeah, when I look at, even when I come to the avant-garde side of things, I like to hear avant-garde that, the individual songs, there has to be something happening melodically to really pull my ear and to really make me say, wow, I can remember that. That's badass. That's so cool. This feels a lot more like the Desolate Shrine album that I listened to last year, and I actually loved that Desolate Shrine album. It was one of my top albums of the year. I just think that Desolate Shrine is a little bit more firmly in the camp of death metal or blackened death metal. And so there are some riffs that you can actually discern in there, and you can say, wow, that sounds like a death metal riff, or that sounds like black metal. This was even farther removed from that style of music. So yeah, again, metal music is kind of guitar centric. I mean, it sort of fetishizes guitar playing in a lot of different genres, and this is like the antithesis of that approach. So take everything you know about heavy metal, throw it out the window when you listen to this thing. What would I rate it? I think this is a good album. I don't think it's going to end up being one of the best of the year, but it's definitely interesting. You know, it's kind of a niche album. It's not going to appeal to very many people, but I think the people that enjoy weird stuff, that like their weirdness to be, you know, dark, dissonant, cacophonous, I think they're going to enjoy this. Fans of bands like Deathspell Omega, Desolate Shrine, I think even some fans of Gorguts, you know, I think those people are going to enjoy this thing more than your typical metalhead. But I wouldn't recommend this thing to your typical metalhead. I would just say the people that are looking for this are going to find it. Everybody else, don't sweat it. This thing's not going to, you know, you're not really missing out on much if you don't already gravitate towards the avant-garde. So, but that's it, guys. That's the review. I know I talked for forever about this thing. There's a lot to say about it. If you dug the video, go ahead and like, comment, subscribe below. Let me know what you'd like to hear me react to or review in the future. This is Metal Album Reactions, and I hope you guys are having a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.